what I saw in these NGOs was there were two kinds of employees. There was the fire starter, the one that just keeps on running no matter what. And it seemed, you know the kind of person where it seems like they can never stop working. They're constantly on, they're highly talented, they're super dedicated. And then there were sort of the other style of worker that were just having a job, which is completely fair. The problem was that the load on these two types of employees was not evenly distributed. And that meant that the ones that were actually pulling a lot of the difference-making work would end up burning out. And the ones that were taking care of themselves and their families were sort of not pulling enough weight for the system to carry on. Those who have been attracted to this line of work have had a tendency to work for something bigger than themselves. And that's also something that's been true for me. And when you work for something that's bigger than yourself, you also have a tendency to move towards sacrifice. And the sacrifice is not just dedicating your career. That is dedication. That is not sacrifice. What's sort of the inherent sort of meaning in the word sacrifice is that it has to be something you cannot afford.
Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. This is Joachim from Green Innovation Group speaking. Thank you for listening in. I really appreciate that. In this episode, I talked to my co-founder, Frederik from Green Innovation Group, about how do we actually cope with the climate change as human beings, and should we be depressed? Should we be hopeful? And we also look a bit into his 15-year journey working as a professional within sustainability and how to make it all work and not burn out and sacrifice yourself in the process, which is unfortunately a quite common issue for sustainability professionals. So enjoy the episode. Hello, Frederik. Super good to have you here on the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast.
Really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And we're in a good mood. We've just had a swim, and it's summer in Copenhagen.
Allegedly the last day of summer.
I surely hope not.
I heard that in the coffee bar.
But it's the time of year. And today we're going to talk about a little bit different than what we normally talk about. Mainly, how is it as a human being to cope with the climate crisis, with the loss of biodiversity crisis and the resource crisis and so on? Do we get depressed? What happens when we do? Are we hopeful? How do we actually handle this? How do we talk about it? So how are you feeling about climate change and the other crisis right now? Small question.
How am I even feeling about that? Compared to the sort of amount of knowledge that I have accumulated during the years, I am feeling disturbingly optimistic. And I'm saying disturbingly because I feel like I shouldn't, knowing what I know. So I'm also questioning if I'm in reality also in a stage of denial.
Yeah.
And I think that could be the case. But I heard a recent statistic from McKinsey that allegedly most of the CO2 emissions are tied up into reduction pledges by now. So that's a good thing, but that's a pledge, and the difference between an action and a pledge is everything. So
that's the whole work basically.
And also the difference between most and all is also something that sort of strikes a chord in me that is a cause for worry. But to answer the question, how do I feel about the climate change right now? Strangely optimistic.
And what you're saying is that, well, when we actually look at the data, there's not as much cause to be an optimist.
No, I need to look at some of the, look at some of the village idiots, as we've been discussing sort of how knowledge regimes are composed of sort of the very heavily scrutinized academia that becomes the IPCC reports, the UN, the United Nations climate reports come from an organ called IPCC, and that's very heavily scrutinized, heavy-duty academic work behind those investigations and those reports. That's sort of one category on the body of knowledge that we orient ourselves towards in Green Innovation Group. And then you had sort of the conceptual idea to use the metaphor of a hedge fund, and then we also hedge with the radical ideas, the radical thinkers out there, the Singularity University kind of thinkers, the Rethink X categories, the moonshotty ideas, the sort of crackpot ideas, you could say, or like the village idiots that go out there and say the emperor is wearing no clothes, and maybe we should look at this in a different way. And I think looking at some of these radical ideas, radical thoughts, is one of the things that can provide me some sort of hope that, maybe we can live in a reality a short time from now where a lot of the main contributors to carbon emissions can sort of be abated. Maybe we can live in a reality in a very short-term future where a lot of the biodiversity crisis can be avoided, or we can start regenerating.
Or the future part, at least, as we're probably not going to bring back all the ones that we...
But the problem is it gets really abstract and hopeful, in a way where it's like, this might work kind of hope, and not, I feel confident this is going to work. That's not at all where I'm at.
But the reason why I'm asking is that whether you're working with sustainability and climate change as a professional, or you're just a citizen or concerned citizen, it's something that we all have to find a way how to deal with. Is something that children ask their parents, what is the world going under, what's actually happening. And I find that there's this very weird spectrum inside of me, at least, and a lot of other people I know, where like a pendulum that you will look at the facts and say, okay, so now 60% of species with a spine has been extinguished over the last 50 years, or however the specific numbers are. And okay, so the temperature has risen this much. We've cut down the Amazonas to a degree where it doesn't produce excessive oxygen, or surplus of oxygen anymore. That's straight up depressing. That's
it is.
And at the same time, maybe especially because we are working in this field, I'm also seeing action every day, seeing changes every day, seeing organizations pull off amazing things at various scales, but nonetheless amazing things in terms of doing things different, doing more sustainable, and we get to be part of the work through the consulting projects that we do with clients. And sometimes it can just feel a bit like a mess inside, and I'm probably not the only one out there.
No.
So, what are your thoughts on this, and how do we actually cope? And is it okay to be depressed about if that's what you are, or how do we cope? Or is it when the optimism is there, is it false?
There's kind of two things I'd like to talk about. One is the idea of a sacrifice, and the other is to those out there wondering, what do you even know about working with sustainability in these difficult agendas? So I figured I'd give a bit of a background story from my own career and sort of what I have seen in the time I've worked in sustainability. So I worked in sustainability for 15 years, and what I've seen throughout those years, I've worked in NGOs and in the private sector, and also a lot in the startup space. And one of the ideas that seems to persist is that there's a tendency that those who have been attracted to this line of work have had a tendency to work for something bigger than themselves. And that's also something that's been true for me. And when you work for something that's bigger than yourself, you also have a tendency to move towards sacrifice. And the sacrifice is not just dedicating your career. That is dedication. That is not sacrifice. What's sort of the inherent sort of meaning in the word sacrifice is that it has to be something you cannot afford. It's not a sacrifice if you can afford it. So a lot of the time I've seen professionals sort of put more than they can afford on that sacrificial altar in the name of sustainability.
So working longer hours, being stressed and still keeping on, neglecting personal relationships to family and kids. And
also just very banal examples like choosing lower salaries as sort of one of the key indicators why this work longer hours, take unpaid jobs to a very high degree, take poorer paid jobs, accept positions with lower degrees of influence inside the organizations where they take work. So, I see a lot of tendencies going on in that agenda, and also accepting that victories are blown out of proportions by sort of entities that have a vested interest in it, leading to greenwashing, CSR washing, SDG washing, and all of these things where organizations are claiming impacts that they're not having in a way. And that's got to be super frustrating to someone, especially in the early days when that was going on a lot.
So you see a lot of sacrifice in the sustainability sector by people working there. How does that chip into how you're handling the climate crisis personally inside, and how we cope with these various kinds of feelings?
The point I want to make is basically if whoever you are selling your time to, make them understand that to be a future-proof entity, they need to take sustainability very seriously, and it has to be part of their core business. And that's a radical shift in the mindset from the sacrifice sort of mentality where we have to give more than we can afford on an individual and organizational level to let's turn this to an advantage. Let's start playing offense and deploy sustainability as one of the tools that we're deploying in this, to use a sports analogy, that turning that into offense. And I think that's quite powerful. And I think the idea of sort of looking at sort of sacrifice and saying, okay, am I sacrificing something here? Am I giving something I cannot afford to give? Because if you are, you're not going to be able to dedicate your career to the cause because you're going to burn out. So that's kind of looking at this as a marathon and not a sprint. And if you have the sacrifice mentality, you're sprinting. But if you have sort of the long-term scope of a person or a subject with agency and empowerment for change, which I believe all of us do carry, then you have to look at it as a marathon. Then you have to look for these levers of influence that you can pull for impact and for effect, and to also provide sort of a way out of despair by letting yourself be empowered in that struggle and mobilize other people into it. So I think that's kind of those are elements, at least in the recipe, to go out of the sacrifice mindset and go into the offense mindset and say, okay, we need to attack this as a business case.
And it's something that we have also sculpted the Green Innovation Group on as well, both because, even management consultants, even when they're working, not working with sustainability, there's still very much this sacrifice mentality, and giving more that you can give is actually the ideal, resulting in burnout and not in longevity. But it also comes from a personal story, and perhaps you could share that, of how you came to some of these realizations from your work in Mexico, and the pendulum swings you had in that part of your sustainability journey between optimism and depression.
Yeah, I think maybe if I'm just going to take it one more step back. So when I was working in Oxfam, what I was seeing was there was basically two kinds of employees in that organization.
It's a developmental NGO.
Yeah, they work on educating people in development countries and building organizations for lasting change, which is super cool. Fully support that, but. I think this holds true for all NGOs. I was in a coordination role, so I worked with all of the NGOs that are getting development aid funds from the Danish government. So what I saw in these NGOs was there were two kinds of employees. There was the fire starter, the one that just keeps on running no matter what. And it seemed, you know the kind of person where it seems like they can never stop working. They're constantly on, they're highly talented, they're super dedicated. And then there were sort of the other style of worker that were just having a job, which is completely fair. The problem was that the load on these two types of employees was not evenly distributed. And that meant that the ones that were actually pulling a lot of the difference-making work would end up burning out. And the ones that were taking care of themselves and their families were sort of not pulling enough weight for the system to carry on. So the way this NGO sector is constructed in its nature it's constructed for someone to burn out. Because it cannot really afford enough talent and enough hands to make the wheels go round in a sustainable manner. I've seen similar things in the music industry where the course is creativity or artistic output, but similar tendencies. And then I've seen it in the startup environment where it's the dream, what's bigger than yourself is kind of the startup entity, right? Where everyone puts all they have on that sacrificial altar and then they go out. But in what has been really interesting to me is to see the sustainability worker in large corporates. Where I think the main cause of frustration is that there's a feeling that there's not always alignment between externally communicated buy-in to a sustainability transformation and what they experience on the floor. So it could be something basic like changing the water faucets or something, and all of a sudden it becomes a capex investment that the procurement department cannot see, and the real estate owners have a different landlord, and then it becomes all sorts of problems, and there's only one person to fix all the problems. So there the problem is slightly different. It's more like there's one person that has a mandate that's not really defined well enough. Where do the agencies start and where does it stop? And sort of to look at that sort of as that sacrificial altar again, I think the solution on an individual level at least, is to insist on asking what is the business case here, why are we doing what we're doing, what is our hypothesis for change, how do we mobilize so we make sure that this is actually what's going to make the difference. And insisting on that it's a marathon, not a sprint. Exactly.
And that if I go down with the stress in a year, maybe I overachieve 10% or 20% in 1 year. But if the subsequent years are spent not working, then that doesn't matter. So you were an anthropologist, deeply interested in creating eco-villages and finding new ways for a food system and other things, and you went to Mexico to test this out.
To investigate sort of the most forward-thinking parts of sort of eco-society, alternative ways of organizing food systems. And it just didn't work. Yeah. So
on a very practical level, you were going to a village in the mountains?
Long story short, I'm going to do the short version. Yeah. So I find myself on a mountainside, very far away from civilization, no gas, no electricity, no running water. And activists believe in the camp that iodine is bad for you, so they refuse to cleanse the water. Everyone has something that can best and most politely be described as storming diarrhea. Sick to the bone, and violently unproductive. So compared to the amount of land that they were claiming, the amount of labor they were claiming from volunteers, they had a production of 1 egg per week when I came. And 6 months later, they had a production of 1 egg per week. So one of the activists in the camp described that to me in a way, I'm paraphrasing the quote here, but she said something along the lines that maybe the work that we're putting in here doesn't have a return in the future, but maybe in the super future. And, you know, I kind of thought that was sort of, you know, that super future is, that's where we cannot work.
It's a different way of saying never.
Yes, and that's something, you know, we cannot afford that.
Yeah, so they were trying to say our normal structure doesn't work, the system is fucked. Let's do something different, create everything ourselves and so on. But it was being done in a very inefficient and not scalable way.
Yeah, and it just wasn't recognizing the achievements of human society. I mean, we've come a very long way. And it doesn't have to stick to a destructive course the way it is right now. I think there's a lot of very desirable models for how to live a very modern human life that doesn't cost more than what we have in the bank account of planetary resources. So I think that was sort of one of the epiphanies I had, was that, you know, I remember one day we were building a house, and the way you build a house is you take a lot of bottles and a lot of mud and a lot of carbon, and then you mix it all together and you build a bottle mud house, as one does. And I was covered head to toe in mud, and I had lost 12 kilos or something from these ongoing food poisonings, and I'm just looking around at this campsite. You know, it took forever to get there, and it was quite a rough place to be. And the thought just strikes me that this is never going to scale. and you know, I don't know how it took me that many years to get there, but then it was like no one in their right minds would go through just a fraction of what I've been. I mean, I was there to conduct an academic field study, right? So I had a reason to be there, and I hope that if I had gone there on my own means and sort of my own accord, I would have left much earlier. But I was there to do academic research. I was paid by the university to be there. So, you know, I hope that was the difference maker for me staying for that long.
How long were you there?
I was there for, the entire project was 6 months, and I lived there for 4 months total. Yeah. So week in, week out, sleeping in a tent on the ground in the camp.
Losing 12 kilos is pretty fast.
There was not a lot left of me. It was kind of, you know, I kept on getting okay-ish, and then I got bad, and then I got okay, and then I got bad. So it took a while for me to consult a proper doctor and conclude that I had a parasite and not just a stomach infection or something. So bad story, gone worse. But if I hadn't gone through that, I wouldn't be where I am today, where I feel like sort of it's part of my own sort of origin story to go through that, to get to the pragmatic business angle that I'm deploying today every day at work. But where I feel like that sort of human-centered approach, where we look at the individuals that we're working with and we need to figure out what is it that makes them tick, what is it that will make a difference in their world, that is really powerful. And that's something I definitely picked up a lot on during that time in Mexico. Just, you know, getting into a line of thinking that is different from your own is a really powerful consulting tool.
Yeah, so I mean that's one of the key approaches that we have adopted. Two key learnings from there. One is that it's usually more. We probably, it's very hard to change the demand, but we can the demand in that case being the demand for food and shelter and convenience that we have in a normal society. We're not going to get people to live in mud houses and build them themselves.
No, but let's not back down from that.
But we can provide the supply to that demand in much more sustainable ways. And the other thing that if you insist on that sustainability change and sustainability work has to be a sacrifice, you are going to burn out. That's why we have 7 weeks of vacation in Green Innovation Group. We insist on taking breaks. We don't work nights and all these things. So,
and you're allowed to enjoy some modern day comforts that I feel like there's a lot in sort of sustainability amongst sustainability professionals. I see a lot of sort of taken for granted eco-shaming. That you're eating meat, or you took a plane, or whatever eco-shaming thing might be in there. You bought a new computer, or you bought new clothes, or whatever it might be, where I think it's kind of not looking at what is carrying the material impact, and then sort of assessing that and saying, okay, I switched to renewable electricity at home. I switched to renewable electricity at my job. I eat mostly vegetarian. I don't cool my home unnecessarily. I moved my pension funds to somewhere where they invest sustainably. There's a lot of sort of things you can do that will passively, they will passively move a lot of chips in a more impactful direction than all of the choices that you make combined every day of the year. So it's also kind of sort of looking at that sacrifice model and saying, okay, what are the sort of one-off actions the individual can take that keeps on paying off on the sustainability agenda? And there's a lot of those. And I think that's something that can provide some sort of comfort that, showing up, voting for the General Assembly with your employer, with your pension fund, that actually makes a big difference. Moving your own funds somewhere sustainable makes a big difference. Some of these things you only have to do it once, but it keeps on paying off. If you do that, I think you can allow yourself a little bit more sort of bandwidth to do other things and spend your mental energy on having an actual impact rather than making sacrifice on a day-to-day. I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, another way to put it would be that we each have a carbon budget. Most of us are overspending on that carbon budget by a lot, but it is still a budget, and you can decide, hey, meat is important for me, or this particular flight is important for me. Great, go do it. Then there's just that less in the budget. But if you take a lot of the other actions, you also find more space in the budget.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, leveraging your time and your thoughts and your ideas and influencing those decisions for other people's decision-making process is some of the most powerful tools we can actually deploy as individuals, right? So, there's a lot to it.
To sum it up, try and focus on not making a sacrifice, but making a difference in the long term. And you are optimistic, but perhaps so unjust. Well, it's a lot more fun to work with an optimistic person too. And
appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the episode. It was a bit of a different one where we went a bit more personal and freewheeling. It was a good conversation. If you like what we're doing here at Green Innovation Group and the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast, it would mean the world to me if you would give our podcast 5 stars on Spotify or Apple Podcast. That way other people get to see it more in their feed, and hopefully we can mobilize even more people to make the healthcare industry sustainable. Thank you for listening in, and enjoy your day.